Hello. My name is Carly. I am here for Laura, who you may notice is not here. So thank you guys for coming. A little bit about Diane. So Diane Sands, she received her bachelor's in anthropology from the University of Montana, Missoula, in 1974, and she completed her coursework towards a master's degree in women's studies at George Washington University. She was the director of the Montana Women's History Project from 1975 to 1990. And co-project director of the Montana Feminist Project from 1999 to 2004, a project dedicated to documenting second-wave feminism. She retired from the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula, where she focused on the history of World War II Japanese internment. She also served 8 years in the Montana State House of Representatives and 8 years in the Montana State Senate. In 2017, the Montana Historical Society Board of Trustees presented her with the Montana Heritage Guardian Award. So we are very lucky to have her. So a little bit about the talk. In 1916, Montana elected 2 women to serve in the legislature, Maggie Smith Hathaway from Ravalli County and Emma Ingalls from Flathead County. They shared a passion for reform issues of the day, including women's suffrage and temperance. Their many social agenda commitments tell the story of the challenges women and families faced in Montana's progressive era. So join former state senator Diane Sands in examining the lives of these 2 trailblazing Montana women. Please welcome Diane, and I'll let her take it from here.
Thanks. She forgot to mention tomorrow at noon is the dedication of, at the Capitol, of the inclusion of Chuck Johnson in the, what do we call that? The gallery of important Montanans. Yeah, so please make that. We all love Chuck so much, and I think that's very important and worthy for him to do that. So glad to see so many old friends, some new friends. Half the retired historical societies here. Nice to know. Actually, this is a talk that, and I'm really honored to be asked to do this. Martha had called, and I gave this in, I think, 2017 or something for a State Historical Society conference. And given this is Women's History Month, it seems appropriate to talk about women's history. In fact, with the Historical Society, I was just asking Bruce, maybe 30 years ago, the Historical Society started in March doing a series of lectures on women's history. Do you remember when it started, either of you? It was, I think, 30 years ago or so. So, I mean, this is a long tradition, and it's fun to be part of it still. So, thank you all. So, yes, I am here and delighted to be here to talk about 2 women I've kind of lived with for the last 30 years, or it feels like it, since I've gotten to know them fairly intimately. Maggie Smith Hathaway and Emma Ingalls. You know, Montana has produced an amazing spectrum of women who are political activists in both the House and the Senate. Now, there, okay. Some of you recognize this lovely room. It still looks just like that, except the people are a little more, well, they look pretty much the same. Whatever. Not much different? Yeah. This is 1919, and then this picture includes both Maggie Smith Hathaway and Emma Ingalls, the first 2 women who were in the legislature. There are very few pictures of either of them, surprisingly. I don't know why there aren't, but there just aren't in any of their archives. So, other than a campaign poster and a formal portrait, this is pretty much what we've got, but I think it's important to see them in context in the House. So, in 1914, these 2 women are, and we'll talk more about them individually, very involved in the campaign for suffrage, convincing men to put on the ballot the general franchise. This was, intense campaign, door to door, standing on street corners, talking in bars, wherever. These were fearless people who had to learn how to deal with people throwing things at them or yelling at them, and they didn't care. They were passionate about this issue. You know, suffrage was an issue that came up actually in the territorial era of Montana. One of the first territorial governor's wives came to Montana as a suffrage activist from the East. But it never went anywhere, and occasionally someone famous would come through and give a speech about suffrage. But it really, until the teens here, with the movement in the West, you really don't see much action on it. Now, most of you all probably know about Jeannette Rankin, and I'm not going to talk about Jeannette, right? We don't need to review Jeannette Rankin here. As a campaigner who, she used her skills. She was one who actually learned how to do this professionally as an organizer. She worked for the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She was a paid organizer in the state of Washington with their campaign in 1910 when suffrage became legal in the state of Washington. So a lot of people think Rankin just sort of emerged out of the head of Zeus or something, but in fact, she was very well trained and aligned with all the national suffrage movements and very well equipped to lead part of the campaign in the state of Montana, not all of it, and then who sees using her skills and turning them to her political advantage and running for office in 1916 when she wins. But most of us really don't know much about other women who were in that era who worked on these political issues, many of whom were elected to office, and so we're going to talk about that. Rankin isn't the first woman. The first Montana Constitution actually gave women who owned property certain rights to vote. So, particularly in school elections, because this whole use of this title I gave this one on unnatural spheres. It was considered women's natural God-given sphere to be in the family and the home and work with children, and men's sphere, natural sphere, God-given, is politics, economics, and the outer world. So when women move into this area, they are in an unnatural sphere. But the only way they can justify it in many ways is because it is working usually with children. And so it sort of is in that gray area. So for ones that might act out in a different way, it's like Angelina Grimke said in 1834 when she was speaking promiscuously about suffrage and abolition to mixed groups of men and women, and the men and the churches complained. She said, all we ask is that our brothers take their feet from off our neck and let us stand up before our God. That's separation of spheres. So women in Montana could vote in some of the school elections because they thought women had a special sensibility for children. I would argue the political world still thinks women have a special sensibility for children, as demonstrated by most of the boards and commissions are women, and we think that the appropriate role for state superintendent of public instruction is a woman's role. We don't talk about it that way, but the evidence shows that we still think about it that way in many cases. So having a man in that role seems somewhat unusual. So that's how we get to the natural spheres look at this particular topic. Well, in 1882, 2 women ran and were elected in Montana to serve as county superintendents of schools. Some of you may have heard of Alice Nichols, but more of you will probably have heard of Helena's own Helen Clark. A few nods. She's a really amazing woman, and I think more people should be aware of her. She was the child of a Piegan woman and her very important, politically powerful father, who had provided her, sent her off for a convent education. And when she comes back with the support of Wilbur Sanders, she secures a teaching position here in Helena, and that's the basis of her running for office. So in 1882, she's elected, and elected 3 times to be county superintendent of schools here in Helena, and achieved quite a bit of progress in terms of professionalizing that whole field, which really was occupied by women, often with a 7th grade education, but trying to make it a more professional field. But she faced quite a lot of really anti-Indian sentiment, families pulling their children out, etc., and eventually she gave up, moved to New York to be an actress for a while, and then moved into advocacy on Indian land issues in Oklahoma. So that perspective on believing what women's natural sphere is, particularly for white women, no one claimed the natural sphere of being delicate, dainty, and working at home was appropriate to Native Americans or African Americans or anywhere else, but that European model of our colonists was that there was a natural sphere that women should be attuned to. But once you, and in fact the basis of that, in the common law, they would say that the husband and the wife are one, and that one is the husband. Women were not legal persons under the law for much of our colonial and early days. The husband is the legal person, so women are not entitled to enter into contracts because they're not a person, be guardians of their own children, etc., etc. And so that just sort of starts to change over time, and even is affecting some of these Montana situations. But in Montana, so the right to be able to vote and be recognized as a legal person, if you are particularly if you own land and you're paying taxes, and then in other categories, if you were a widow or a single woman, they could take out a homestead in their own name. A married woman could not, but a single woman or a widowed woman could. Some of our famous stories in that area are really around that thing. And then of course once you were married, where you could work was really limited, and if you got pregnant, even in schools, you either resigned or you were fired. It was just considered inappropriate. So the job of the educator was really, the job of the woman was really to educate children, whether it's in the home or in school. And so running as a state superintendent was really considered appropriate for women. And some of you wouldn't be surprised to find that the first person elected to be state superintendent of public instruction who was a woman was May Trumper in this same 1916 election here in Helena. And she began that tradition that we only elected women. We have only had one male as a state superintendent of public instruction. Anybody remember Ed Arkenbright? Only time we have elected a male since that time to be state superintendent of public instruction. Subtext there is kind of interesting. Other women who were politically active in early suffrage campaigns claimed not only the right to vote, but the right to hold office. Ella Knowles, how many of you know Ella Knowles? The attorneys in the room might, some of you might. She was a suffrage activist, college graduate from Bates in '84. When women first start attending colleges, and she taught school here in Helena as well, and sat privately to study the law and was admitted to the bar. So she's Montana's first female attorney. She opened a practice in Butte, got involved in politics. She championed the emerging populist party, the People's Party, which stood for all kinds of very liberal social causes of the day, social reforms. It was considered a radical party by most, even in her time. But in 1892, Knowles was nominated by that party for state attorney general. So she ran for attorney general, ran a good race, came in a bare second, and was appointed by the winner, assistant attorney general of Montana. She was appointed assistant attorney general by her opponent, who became attorney general, Henry Haskell. In fact, she married him at one point. Didn't last long, but she married him at one point. But for 4 years, she served in the job of being Assistant Attorney General in Montana in the 1890s. So, she was an ardent social reformer. So she not only ran for statewide office, she's the first woman to speak in front of the legislature about suffrage. So, she definitely was outside of her natural sphere, I would say. So women's suffrage in Montana, as I said, is a real on and off kind of thing after the Civil War, when Montana was being settled by people from all over, depending on the activism and the history of those individual women who are moving here, their advocacy around this issue. And once we get the train, we're on the tour for some of the national suffrage speakers as they roll through the state of Montana. But there's no real traction for this until about 1900, a little after. And it's really based on the states in the Northwest, Washington being the main one, increases the ante and really works to pass suffrage. And there's a reason that suffrage passes in the West before it passes in the East. So as I said, Rankin is out in the state of Washington as a paid campaigner during all of this. But once it passes in 1910, all these other states around it say, we could do that, let's get going and actually make it happen. So, and the national organizations start pouring money into the West because they realize the polling looks pretty good here and they think they can get it done. So there are many coalitions that do this. So it's not just Rankin and it's not just the suffrage organization. So it's the state suffrage organization, part of the National American Women's Suffrage Organization, which after suffrage passes becomes the group known as the League of Women Voters. That's what transitions to become that. There's the General Federation of Women's Clubs, the biggest women's organization of the turn of the century then. They're in, there's hundreds of them and groups. The American Association of University Women, which I am now the state president, which started in Montana in 1909. And the Women's Christian Temperance Union. My grandmother was the state president of that in Bozeman, and I was pledged as a temperance baby as a child. And the temperance organization, as unpopular as we think that issue is, as you know, eventually does pass prohibition. And at this time, there were 202 local unions in Montana. Every little town had a temperance organization based primarily in the Protestant churches. A lot of anti-Catholic stuff going on there, which is a topic for another day. But those groups all formed together into a coalition that were finally successful in convincing the legislature to put it on the ballot in 1914. So you've heard about Rankin, who clearly, she did like 7,000 miles crisscrossing the state, as did a number of other people on campaigns. Hazel, and I've never learned to say her last name, Hunnekens. Anybody got a better way of saying it, from Billings? She's the other, really should be known, feminist activist of this day. She's one who pinned herself to the White House and picketed the White House and did all of that. And most of the people I'm talking about wanted nothing to do with her or the Women's Party because they were the radical fringe. But she's the other Montana activist with Rankin who's operating at that national level. So I'm going to talk to you about some other women who joined Alice Nichols, Helen Clark, Ella Knowles, Jeanette Rankin, May Trumper in seeking office in that same period, because they all come out of this milieu of activism around suffrage and seeing what the issues are and why you're going to have suffrage. So Maggie Smith Hathaway and Emma Ingalls. Who are they? How did they break this glass ceiling, and what difference did their years make? Let's see if we can pop one of them up. This is Maggie Smith Hathaway and a Women's Christian Temperance Union convention. This is the portrait she uses pretty much all of her life. It's on the front of the book and other things as well. So she, again, is an immigrant to Montana. She comes from Ohio, where she was born in 1867, and her family is really important in forming her. Her dad is a very prominent Methodist preacher, and her mother is a very strong activist, WCTU leader and suffrage activist. That family is very involved in social moral reforms of all kinds through the church and other kinds of activities. Maggie, when she's a teenager, is a leader of the Methodist youth group known as the Epworth League. It's a very active, very liberal youth organization of the Methodist Church. And so she, while she's a teenager, she is learning the leadership skills of organizing. She writes extensively. She speaks at several national conferences as the keynoter when she is a teenager on moral social issues. So her family moves to, she gets a college degree in education, of course, to become a teacher, and her family moves to Helena here in 1884, and she takes a job as a teacher. And she continued throughout her career in a real leadership role and a national role in state as on behalf of the Methodist Church. She was a teacher and a principal for 29 years before the legislative issue even comes up. She serves 2 terms as county superintendent of schools for Lewis and Clark County, and she really built on the efforts to professionalize the teachers' education with Helen Clark. So many of the things that they did, creating systems and standards in writing for teachers, for students. She created teacher training institutes, school board written policies, rigorous academies for different topics, including a focus, of course, on moral character for teachers. As county superintendent, she published the first report in 1905 on the state of education as she saw it in the state of Montana. And it's quite a treatise on what she thought education should be and where it had failed. Included in her analysis is the key issue of the disparity in men and women's pay as teachers. At that time in Helena, men were paid $155.20 a month, and women were paid $81.90 a month. And from that, not just recognition, but passion about the issue there, it results in her later sponsorship of legislation and passing the Montana Equal Pay Act of 1919, which is the first equal pay statute in the United States. Now, I'm going to tell you, we still don't have equal pay by any numbers that you want to measure it. So over 100 years we've been working on this. We're not there yet. From 1906, in fact, my mother was paid less when she went back because my dad was a teacher, and they said, well, he's supporting a family, so she didn't need to be paid it then. Very common. Pin money, it's extra. Yeah. Her efforts in this period of her life are not only substantial as an educational leader, but also it's where she really honed her skills as a writer, a speaker. She's actually known nationally as the Montana Hummer. She could talk, that woman. She wasn't afraid of conflict of any kind or those public roles that a lot of other people sort of stepped back from. She's consistently in the national arena as a person who advocates for this wide range of social issues that she's going to take up as a legislator. Her professional life as a teacher ended in 1911 when she married Dr. Henry Hathaway. She was 40, and he was the deputy superintendent of schools in the state, a marriage that ended in 6 months when he died of heart failure. So she became a widow very quickly at the age of 40. The grieving Hathaway moves back to Stevensville, which is where her family has 640 acres and raising apples, and they've got other kids and things, but she moves back home intending to retire. Well, her mother didn't think that was going to be something that was acceptable, and her mother was president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in the state, and so she very quickly had Hathaway back out on the circuit speaking and organizing for those issues. And in 1913, she came to Helena, where her sister also lived, and she took a job as the staff secretary for the House Committee on Public Morals, Charities, and Reform. So you laugh, she's taking a staff job in the legislature, learning how the legislature actually works, all of the processes, legal procedures, getting to know all the legislators on an individual basis. She never knew that 6 years later she would be chairing that committee as a first-time legislator. So all of that training as a staff person really prepared her well for being a legislator. She speaks extensively nationally on educational reform, suffrage, temperance, and to some degree farm issues. They've got a farm, trying to make it go. That's one of her constituency groups. She devoted herself in 1914 for the passage of suffrage to be on the ballot. She traveled almost 6,000 miles by car and train and other ways across the state, earning her the nickname the Whirlwind. She argued women should have the vote on the grounds that women were taxpayers, and also that they brought a greater moral influence to politics. Hence, where is it? Women clean up politics. This whole view that women are morally superior, being over in that special God-given natural sphere, and they're going to bring those values into the public arena. A testament to her effective organizing, her home county of Ravalli cast the highest percentage of votes for suffrage in the state of Montana. It says a lot. The 1915 legislative session, she again became a full-time lobbyist in Helena, this time for the Legislative Council of Montana Women, a 10,000-member strong coalition of the Montana State Suffrage Association, League of Women Voters, Women's Christian Temperance Union, AUW, General Federation of Women's Clubs, Montana Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, the Montana Teachers Association, and a handful of others. This is the early precursor, unknown to us, of the Montana Women's Lobby. This powerful coalition, with all of her connections and her skills in lobbying and speaking and knowing how to get things done in there, was successful in getting the legislature to pass the first law giving women equal legal rights with fathers to the guardianship of their children. Again, in many places women are not a legal person, so you have to make these special laws to actually acknowledge and give them that status to be a guardian of their own child. And secondly, passing a bill that provided the first grants to deserving indigent mothers for caring for children. This is a major campaign in her entire life, and as part of Rankin's commitment in the Shepherd-Towner Act at the federal level, providing mothers support for indigent families. With the success of the women's suffrage campaign, you shouldn't be surprised that the women who led the campaign and learned all those political skills, made those networks, and had the capital to ran for elected office. So Hathaway's record in her journal, she says, Jeanette Rankin called her up, and they were of different parties, but called her up and asked her if she would help run her congressional campaign. And Hathaway said, I said no, and in a flash, I decided to run for office myself. She capitalized on the national wave of activism around suffrage, prohibition, moral reform, as well as her prominence in her county as the base for her campaign. She ran and was elected as a Democrat from Ravalli County in 1916 election and served in 1917. She finished only 23 votes behind the other winner. And that time you ran elections by county, and so the two highest votes person went. So she ran on a platform of agriculture, support for farmers, and moral issues. As she said, moral issues are the core of politics. The laughing legislator over here. As a side note, in that election, the 5 western states, 11 women were elected to legislative office that year for the first time, and 9 of those 11 were Democrats. So again, the West really leads with this idea of women being somewhat more independent. They've been homesteaders. Men can see them working on the ground as full partners, etc. as part of the theory of why suffrage is more receptive in the West. So the 2 women who serve in both 1917 and 1919 in the House are Maggie Smith Hathaway, who's a Democrat from Ravalli County, and Mrs. Emma Ingalls, who's a Republican from Flathead County. So while they're of opposing parties, they both come from a really strong background of all this social reform, and they're very like-minded on issues. I could not find that they ever disagreed on anything, but so they're both also recent widows. They both have inherited farms from husbands and families that have died, and they both present themselves to their community as businesswomen, as women who are in charge and capable of managing finances. So they very much don't look like ordinary women in an ordinary sphere. They are very much outside that model. Like Hathaway, Emma Ingalls came to politics through her professional life. She married Clayton Ingalls in 1879 and with him established a farm and a newspaper in Kalispell, the Kalispell Interlake, which you're probably familiar with. She loved the newspaper. She wrote all the editorial, she handled all the sales, the circulation. She was the person out and about. And she's fearless in using the newspaper to expose corruption, including a campaign against a sitting judge for his arbitrary handling of a murder case. In this case, the judge was really angry, and he demanded an apology from the newspaper, and he arrested Mr. Ingalls for contempt for refusing to do it. She had written the editorials. He didn't get the apology, and instead Emma reprinted an even more detailed account of the judge's behavior. And as she said, his decisions were always in favor of the last drink of whiskey. So she succeeded in getting him removed from office and found herself as an outspoken advocate for reform, prohibition, suffrage, and all the other corruption of the day. Mr. Ingalls suffered from poor health. He was kind of a silent partner in some ways, and he died leaving her the farm, and she became a real pioneer in agriculture in that area. She was the first to irrigate land, and she introduced alfalfa as a crop in the area. So both of them have these really similar patterns around marriage and widowhood and a farm they're responsible for, and public successes in other arenas before they get to the legislature. So in 1914, Ingalls sells the farm and devotes herself full-time to suffrage activities and the Republican Party. She serves in a leadership role as both secretary and then the chairman, they called it that, of the Flathead Republican Party. So with the success of the suffrage amendment, like Rankin and Hathaway, she casts her hat in the ring to run for Flathead County, and she runs twice and is elected, 17 and 19, before she chose to retire. One session, she's in the majority. One session, Hathaway's party's in the majority. And yet their path to the legislature is so close to identical, you can't hardly tell them apart. Her roles in the legislature, as I say, parallels Hathaway. She serves as chair of the Committee on Public Morals, Charities, and Reform, and she sponsored the bill. Her name would be on it, and a co-sponsor would be Hathaway. Hathaway would sponsor it. Her name would be on as a co-sponsor. Her name was on the one for the ratification of the federal constitutional amendment once it comes out from Congress for state ratification. She passed the bill calling for prohibition, and she's the one who has the bills to create the institution, including Mountain View Vocational School for Girls, right here in her second term. We don't have as much of a rich record of her life that she left as we do for Hathaway. Hathaway was extremely aware of her own legacy and history, and in fact, in the archives, and she wrote page after page, word for word, and Tasher, who printed this, it is literally word for word what she wrote of her own. It could be an autobiography, it's barely a biography. She edited, she had an image of herself she wanted projected, and that are the only records that exist. The rest is gone. So, interesting perspective on herself. What we do know is that both of them viewed their world and their mission really in the same way. As Ingalls said, God put me on his anvil and hammered me into shape. The things that seemed so hard to bear at the time have proven to be the stepping stones to a larger, richer life. So for both of them, it really was their way out of widowhood. In 1919, the legislature is controlled by the Democrats, Hathaway's party, and they deal with a lot of issues aftermath of World War I in particular. And some of those around veterans are really interesting. It's everything from creating a Veterans Welfare Commission, a pension fund for veterans, soldiers' homes are created, and then, of course, the very repressive Sedition Act, which criminalized all forms of free speech of anyone speaking against the government, of which they were both huge supporters, as was most of the country. The prohibition of exhibition of the red flag, because the Russian Revolution had just happened, so we weren't going to see any flags up relative to that. Requiring English only, which I know really affected like my family in Macomb County, who were all came as German speakers and spoke German at home, and churches were in German newspapers. Nope, that's the end of that. So, and then there were, in addition to all the war issues that they were dealing with, they really work on the creation of the infrastructure for government, which I found really fascinating, and health issues that are related to that. Venereal disease in veterans, of course. Establishing a state sanitarium for drug addiction. And then you have the 1918 flu epidemic. So public health in those different kinds of ways becomes very important. They establish a state sanitarium for addiction. They look at creating all kinds of specific programs in the non-existent health department yet, looking to create answers because the public really demanded that they address them. From my looking at the journals and the legislative journal over in the Capitol, I was just struck by how much of the legislation of that period is around creating the infrastructure of government, departments that didn't exist before, institutions that didn't exist before, because the public in that era was really expressing a demand for public solutions to these rather than private solutions to these. Very interesting in our day. In 1917, as a freshman legislator, the majority party, Democrats, Hathaway is immediately appointed chair of the Committee on Public Morals, Charity, and Reform. Also serves on the Libraries Committee and on the Committee on Appointments and Representation. The Legislative Journal on day 2 of the session shows Hathaway introducing 2 bills. One is HJR 5, supporting the newly formed League of Nations as a means to enforce peace, and is HJ1 asking Congress to support the national suffrage amendment to the Constitution, which then passes the Montana House on day 5. Again, nationally, women don't have the vote yet. Nationally, but they do in Montana. And these are all co-sponsored by Ingalls. And that happens then in the reverse in the next session. For all this concern about how women are accepted in the male world, there just is very little in the legislative record or newspapers about that. When the governor gives his opening day address, he doesn't even mention that there are now women in the body. But Hathaway writes about this, and they talked about this. They were very astute in how they were going to deal with her entrance into this male system. Quoted in the Miles City Star, quote, "They planned to keep their eyes open and their lips shut until they both had shown men that they were not freaks, but were actively worth working for because of their desire to help." So, I don't know, introducing all these bills and chairing a committee and the first day is being quiet. I don't quite see that, but they talked about that themselves, and that it was they were very personable, both of them. I mean, Hathaway, you don't pick it up as much here, but There are comments about how she was redheaded and fun to be around and a joking personality and very collegial in that way. So they were very, very intentionally social with their male colleagues. So both of them were very active in supporting each other because of that. In fact, they use the word we when they write about things that they're doing together. So I wish we knew more about them, but you know, as a former legislator, and those who are here, you know how much effort it takes and how rare it is to have a genuine cross-party friendship where people get things done. It is hard, and it is unusual. And so to see that partnership and their collaboration on issues because of that passionate commitment to moral reforms, you have to assume that their bond was really very intense. And their shared status, of course, as widows and farmers. Some of the bills in the 1917 legislature is really interesting. 2 months they met. First day, limiting women who work for wages to an 8-hour day, except of course domestics, women of color who are working limitless hours. They didn't think that was natural for European women to be working long hours when they should be at home. February 5th, control of state lands for the welfare of children. State lands income shall fund schools. That designation of state lands as the source of income for public schools still stands today. They did that. The other bills they had, next bill they had, anti-cigarettes for minors. Well, they lost that one on a parental rights argument that was up to parents to deal with. Familiar theme. And then the Children's Aid Law of 1917 that Hathaway had shepherded through the legislature in 1915 becomes the Mother's Pension Law, and it provides small grants to indigent mothers of good moral character. Quote, an act relating to the mother's pension and for the care of dependent children in their own home by their mother, the father of the said children being dead or an inmate in some Montana institution, or who is physically or mentally incapacitated and whose mother is financially unable to support such children. Both of them had a strong belief that you shouldn't really send children off to orphanages, etc., that the best place for children was going to be retained in the home. And you see later when she becomes the head of what becomes the Department of Health and Human Services, the Bureau for Children, she goes out and will visit these families and assess what they need, and if they need help, she'll go to the county commissioner and badger them into providing a small stipend for that family to keep them together. So this is very much part of their worldview of how families should be supported by the community. They passed a bill, as we said, for establishing a state vocational school for girls and a state orphanage in Twin Bridges, and they required free education be provided to all the inmates, as they called the people who were in those institutions. And my favorite, for both of them, they stood their ground and spoke on issues that had strong opposition, prohibition in particular. In fact, I want to read you a short section from here that I think says a lot about their relationship with the body as a whole. The lady from Ravalli clashed on several occasions with Representative Higgins, a Republican of Missoula, a handsome bachelor. When a bill concerning the welfare of children was being considered, Higgins chided her for having no more children than he had. Another time, Higgins shook his fist at Mrs. Hathaway and shouted, "This is no place for a woman, go home and stay there." When a representative seated at hand arose to demand an apology, she quickly said, "I want no apology. I like the fellow who was kicked by a mule. I consider the source." A few days later, Mrs. Hathaway supported Higgins on a measure involving the university. He turned to a fellow legislator saying, "She's the biggest man in the house." I thought she'd be mad at me to the close of the session. She made it a point, if she opposed someone's legislation, that within the next day she would in some way stand and support a piece of theirs. And then in another case, while a legislator seated next to her was in a drunken stupor, people drank in the legislature all the time through the 70s and into the 80s. But these guys were just drunk on the floor. So while a legislator seated next to her was in a drunken stupor, the bill came up to enforce state prohibition for a vote. It had been introduced in the Senate, but had been piloted through the House by Mrs. Hathaway. He was like passed out. She just nudged him and voted, "Vote aye." He pushed the button and voted. Which used to be a habit in the House, voting for somebody else was kind of odd, but okay. Yeah. So they were very respected by their colleagues who constantly referred to them in these really positive terms, as did the press. So things they called Hathaway were things like Mary has her way, but it's a good way. Champion of women and children. A good fellow can give and take it like a man. The biggest man in the house. And first she said she was kind of insulted, and then she took it for what it was meant to be. In that 2-month session at the end of it, Hathaway summed up the experience for herself and Ingalls. And again, she uses the word we. We have justified our presence here. We came as pioneers and had to establish our status. So she is very directly concerned with making sure that they're going to have a future in the legislature, because she views politics not particularly in a partisan manner. I thought this statement of hers about political parties, she says in an address she was giving on power and politics, to keep an open mind, study political conditions, and keep posted on all of it. Do not permit any political party to obscure your vision. Be ready to recognize the good where it is found, bearing in mind that the party of your choice, or rather the party you inherited from your father, now be honest, is not that the source of your party affiliation, may not have a monopoly on all the good ideas or principles of for people. What was good yesterday may not be the best today, and what is best today may not be best tomorrow. I want you to be interested in the political game in the highest sense. So I mean, she has a really different political perspective than we think of someone who's running in a partisan electoral world. A year later, there's a special session in February of 1918, and Hathaway sponsors the bill now that's been referred to the states for ratification, the suffrage amendment to the U.S. Constitution for women other than Native Americans, because again, Native Americans are not citizens in the United States till 1924. She's also involved in a lot of still war-related measures because of the mobilizing of the whole country around loyalty issues. She supports all this loyalty legislation related to sedition, and in fact gives these impassioned speeches. I'll read you briefly of one. She supports soldiers and sailors in needing certain legal rights and the right to vote, which some of them didn't have. A bill she spoke passionately in support of appropriated $500,000 to the Council of Defense for seed grain to needy farmers who were raising crops for support of the war. She, like just about everyone else, gave out all support for the war, Rankin being an exception, and she became one of the well-known 4-minute speakers of the Committee of Public Information, all capitals, who supported the war and went on speaking tours throughout the state. And for all of I've been saying about how sort of conciliatory she's been, listen to this. First, she's trying to sell people bonds. First, for those who make sacrifices to buy bonds to the limit, they are intelligent, loyal, praise them. Second, persons whose hearts ache because they cannot afford to buy because of a mortgage or debts or sickness or inability to make money, they're patriots, honor them. Third, those who can afford to buy bonds and do not, they're slackers, make them ashamed. Fourth, those who sympathize with Germany but buy bonds for business effect, thinking they can afford to lose $50, they are skunks. Convert them or drive them out. Fifth, the pro-Germans who are too ignorant to know that we're fighting for democracy and against the system that forced them to leave their own country and come here where they can make a living in freedom from autocratic power, they are leeches. Convince them or send them back to their dear old Kaiser. And sixth, the IWW, either too ignorant to recognize freedom when they see it or too lazy and anarchistic by nature to earn a living. They are traitors. Make them see the error of their ways or put them out of the way. That's pretty strong language. So when she takes up an issue, she works it with passion and with her ability to speak. So Hathaway is re-elected again in 1918 to serve in the 1919 legislative session, and the platform she runs on is support for the war, labor, farmers, and of course prohibition. She got more votes for election to the legislature than any other candidate in the state of Montana. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. But the Democrats lost to the Republicans, and they became the minority, 64-32. She stayed on the Public Morals Committee, which was now chaired by Emma Ingalls, and she continued to serve on public health and sanitary affairs as well as state institutions. She continued to work on veterans issues and supported a bill to require Americanization courses in high schools. That time, like my dad spoke German at home until he started school. So that whole effort to make people Americans, and what did that require? Speaking English and adopting Americanization as an effort. So she continues to work on veterans issues, but she also supports other issues. Her chief issue in 1919 is the Equal Pay Bill. This time it's not only illegal, she makes it a misdemeanor to pay a woman less than a man for the same service. And I don't know how many people were ever charged with they're in fact doing that, but it's in the law. And she was an ardent supporter of labor, a bill to limit women to work not just 8 hours a day, but only 6 days a week, saying it reflected God's pattern for creation. On the seventh day you rested. I don't think that worked for women of color who were maids, but. And in the special session of July of 1919, called because of widespread drought and the need to address the ratification of the suffrage amendment, Hathaway took on a number of issues, including farm supports. And she worked to create a Montana Welfare Committee, established the TB Sanitarium in Galen, and the regulation of commodities to curb profiteering during the war, for which she was called a socialist. She apparently laughed at that. The 1920 election was a Republican landslide and reduced the Democrats from 32 to 9. Ingalls chose not to run for a third term, and that left Hathaway as the sole woman in office. The Democratic caucus elected her unanimously as the minority floor leader. She is the first woman in the United States to hold a leadership position in a legislature. No woman is going to hold a legislative leadership position in Montana again until 1970s, when my dear partner Ann Mary Dusso was elected Democratic Majority Leader. Quite a gap there. Hathaway serves on the same committees, and again she's back to chairing the Committee on Morals. The bill she championed included at this point creating a board of motion picture censors, banning minors in pool halls. Think River City, and you've been there. Sen on their breath, whatever. Banning liquor advertising, giving the governor the power to remove county attorneys and sheriffs for misconduct, providing veterans preference in employment, and creating a tax on oil production and electrical generation for school funding, which was killed by Montana Power. And she continued to support the federal Shepherd-Towner Maternity Act activities in creating all these health initiatives. She attended in 1920 the National Democratic Convention as a candidate. In fact, she spent time visiting with the President of the United States and was his guest at the State of the Union, sitting next to our state senator. And in 1921, she decided not to run again for the legislature. Clearly, when your party's in such a minority, I think she realized she'd done all she could do, and she didn't run again, but she decided to run as a half-hearted candidate for Congress, not as a Democrat, but as an independent, which really infuriated all of her colleagues. And she lost. She didn't really try, but that was the end of her. She was considered a spoiler, and that's really the end of her elected career. However, in 1923, she's again the lobbyist for the Council of Montana Legislative Women, now way more than 10,000. WCTU, women's clubs, parent-teacher organizations, Montana TV Association, AUW, Home Economics Association, League of Women Voters, American Legion Auxiliary, the Daughters of the American Revolution, and others. That is one hell of a coalition. And the issues they dealt with included support for sterilization of those considered mentally unfit or epileptics, eugenics policies, penalties for the sale of liquor to minors, and support for a wide range of health initiatives. She also, in that time under that job, wrote a manual of laws for Montana pertaining to children in 1926. I've read it. It's this thick. It is literally every law that might touch on children's legal rights, health, family, abuse in the courts, etc. All of those issues. That's really one of her true passions. Then the third stage of her life, outside of the legislature, she is appointed in 1925 and serves till 1937, over 10 years. She's appointed by the governor as the Chief Administrative Officer, the Secretary of the Bureau of Child Protection, which was known when it was created in 1902 as the Bureau of Children and Animal Protection. But she and Hathaway managed to just push the animals off into another committee over in the ag area and just keep the children. And in that capacity, they were responsible for everything having to do with kids. Here's the list in her words. Responsible for all aspects of child welfare, from neglect, incest, mental health, crippled children, orphanages, caseworkers, courts, adoption, foster care, education, child labor, and they launched Big Brothers and Big Sisters. So all of that is in her world. And she creates the infrastructure in there and professionalization of the work in that area. Social work, the way she kind of did professionalization of teaching when she was superintendent of schools. And that, she hires the first psychiatrist, the first psychologist, the professionally trained social workers to go out and work in all these counties. And she goes out with them and, as I said, visited lots of these families to see what's going on and what do they need, and do they need additional money from someone or whatever activity to support them. They also ran the Better Babies campaign, which was, you know, child mortality was just enormous at this point. I mean, 1 in 5 kids is going to die before the age of 5, and it's the leading cause of death for women, adult women, is pregnancy. So Better Babies is a big part of the campaign of all these organizations. So they would set up clinics and training all over the country. And I happened to find, when I was looking at pictures of this and whatever, my own mother's Better Baby Health Survey from 1922 when she was born, which is questions such as, does he have a daily nap with the windows open? Is he in bed by 7 or 8? Does he clean his teeth? Does he have a bath twice a week? Do not take him to public gatherings at night. Do send him to school when he is 6. Has he been vaccinated for diphtheria and smallpox? All of these, and weights and measures, and is their growth and development normal? If it's not, we will send in someone to help, a nurse or someone else to help work on that. This is the Better Babies campaign to keep kids alive. Yeah. So all of that is really the beginning of the Department of Health and Human Services. All that infrastructure is in place. Pretty amazing legacy in my view. So in summary of Hathaway, I really think her career in public service as an educational leader, those first 29 years, as a legislator, and then as the head of the Bureau of Child Protection is really substantial and unrecognized. She's really driven by that passion for the betterment of women and children and families. She's grounded in the social movements of the day around moral and social reform. She turns rhetoric and moral philosophy into law and into institutionalized realities. Regardless of the judgment these days we may place on some of those activities, such as eugenics or in sedition, they really were the leading edge of social change of the day, and they left Montana with all the institutions and policies that many of us still continue today. So I think both of them were quite phenomenal and deserve the recognition they now have. Outside of the Senate, there is a plaque outside the door, the early women of Montana legislature, and there is, in relief, there is both Hathaway and Ingalls, who well deserve to be recognized there. I've got more to say, but that's all I'm going to end with. How about some questions? And while she's going around, I do want to throw out one thing that's lovely. Women did sometimes vote in Montana earlier as well. Susan B. Anthony was an advocate of this, just wanting to claim that she had women had a natural right because they were citizens to vote, and so they would do these radical things, just go vote. Well, in 1883, a group of women, 31 women, went and voted on a city incorporation bill. They just marched in and voted, and the people at the elections office didn't know what to do, so they let them vote. And they claimed, you know, there was a right to suffrage, and the citizens, tax-paying citizens, they had a right to vote on this. So we have a long tradition of going outside our sphere in Montana, one to be well proud of. Questions?
If anyone has any questions, speak now.
Oh, come on.
Anyone?
Thank you very much. I've got a question about the Senator Sands.
Yes, Representative.
So, how did the Senator,
Senator, the
I
Honorable
did my time in the House, but that's not doing my time in the Senate. Anyway, Diane, what in your life got you interested in studying women's history, along with women's rights? And
well, I think for all of us, we want to know where we came from. Who are our people? What's our background? Some of us get involved in terms of family history, you know, whether it's genealogy, kind of the rage of the day, or your DNA status or whatever. But, you know, and I do love finding your roots. I mean, I think it really demonstrates how important knowing who your people were, where you come from, what that culture is like, what was important to your family, what did they value, what difference did they make in the world. So that was important to me as well. I had an aunt who started museums and did things like that, and my grandmother in Bozeman, the Women's Christian Temperance Union pledge, 17 lines back to the Revolution. Most of them owned slave plantations in the South, etc. So I was never really interested in my own history, but I was aware of it. And then growing up on the Fort Peck Indian Reservation, I was very aware of the teaching of white history in my high school. It made me furious. And so when I first went to college, I wanted to learn about that, but there were no courses on it, and I ended up in Chicago with King and all of that in '67, and we were teaching Black Studies to kids, and I went, this is exactly what we need to do in Montana, is have history of ourselves. So that kind of got me involved in all of this, and on and on and on it went. But I think it's an evolving idea still. We're still trying to decide who we are, I think. We're not sure, and right now it's a huge issue. Who are we? What do we want? What are our values? What are we going to honor? And what are we going to remember? I mean, so much of Montana is settled by immigrants who seem to not be aware of what that history is, and the struggles that our ancestors who were immigrants, and the struggles of Native people who lost their land and their living as part of that process. So I think it's important to me personally, but I think it's important to all of us. I mean, I do see history, I try to be objective and tell you when I'm not, but I do see history as a social tool, a political tool. I mean, how do we bind ourselves together in a country that's as diverse as ours, or as diverse as even our state is, if we don't want to claim some common heritage around values and our families and other people, and new people moving in have no idea what that is. I mean, we also need a historical welcome wagon for people. I bought 12 copies of the Historical Society's Martha Cole's textbook for, is it 4 through 12? 12 copies of it, and I give it out regularly. I say, if you're a newcomer, read this. It'll take you a couple hours, lots of pictures. You'll understand something about the general Montana history and the essential understandings for Native people. Best I can do, because I don't know what else to do to try to wrap new people into understanding what Montana has at least been, whatever they think it is, watching Yellowstone. So history is an important part of bringing us together as a community. You know, do we want to all live in separate McMansions, or do we want to live as a community? And what is it that binds us together that way? So I think it's extremely important it's not a hobby in any way, shape, or form.
Thank you.
Why do any of the rest of you do history? Anybody else want to offer why you do history? Hi.
Hi. So these two amazing women did great stuff. And then there was a gap before women were in the legislature again. Can you address why was there a gap? Great examples, out there talking. You would think lots of women would be going, I could do that. And that didn't happen. And how did we do after we got back in? Can you talk a bit to that?
Well, sort of. Let's see. Well, first of all, we hit the Great Depression. You know, we have a huge economic collapse. And like Northeast Montana lost 2/3 of its population. All the white people left. I mean, we had a huge economic crisis in this country. That's what people were focused on, and a lot of people in the state left. So, I mean, it's just a total change of the times and viewpoints. Now, on the other hand, we don't see there's a woman elected in the Senate in the 30s. We just see one here and one there, basically until the 1960s. So women are not in this sphere, but like with the League of Women Voters, they are working in these women's organizations. In fact, since they're at home, and particularly women who are educated, view that as their moral responsibility and social obligation is through like the League of Women Voters. They would do 2-year-long study groups on topics. AUW in Glendive with the development of coal strip, Louise Cross, who then goes to the Constitution and proposes the measures on clean and healthful environment. It's a 2-year study that her local women's group had had. They work in women's auxiliaries. They work in labor unions. They work on those, they sort of take this and put it on the ground and try to, and get involved in local government issues and in their schools and things of that sort more, very much less in elected office anywhere in the country. And then again, you know, it pops up with the creation of the second wave of feminism, challenging all institutions and all of that as a result after World War II. But yeah, it's a significant gap in running for office. The other one in here I didn't bring it, I was trying to find it, was when Rankin lost. Do any of you know who she ran against? Come on. Famous Linderman, Frank Linderman. And he wrote this letter to one of the big political bigwigs about his losing, and the comments are just stunning. He holds no malice to her, and after all, but, and you may find this language interesting, the sword has passed, the spear has passed from the buck to the squaw, he says, and the world is now what it was. I don't know if this will be for good, but the world seems undone to me. And he's very positive about it, but kind of saying, oh, God, what did we do? He does that. Now, that's not over. The first time I read for office, I couldn't find this one either. I have saved it. An anonymous note. What are you doing running for office? Why don't you stay home with your children? Women don't belong in politics. 1997. I mean, so you still do hear it in times and places, and I think part of the backlash we're saying now is, again, what is the appropriate sphere for women? What is the appropriate sphere for men? Men should be in charge of the world, but you know, they should be in charge of their families. Women should be in a supportive role, yada, yada, yada. Those themes come and go throughout our history. It's nothing new. It's a little shocking at times, the words they use, but nonetheless. That answer that question? There's not a great answer for that. Somebody else who thinks about that? You got any idea on that? But they just, yeah.
But I do have a question. At the turn of the 20th century, the Republican Party was the progressive party. But you mentioned that the first women elected in the state were largely Democrat.
Yeah.
So was it that they didn't align with the necessarily progressive party where they would get support? They kind of really seemed to crisscross. Can you speak a little bit about the party affiliation?
Yeah, I mean, it changes at the national level. I mean, Wilson, you know, the progressives don't support women's suffrage, et cetera, maybe just threatened by the power of these whole movements. But both parties have difficulty, although it is, and then Southern Democrats, of course, but yeah, the Progressive Party is the Democratic Party in general, although there are all these third parties that also are out there. It is not the Democrats. They're the ones who generally oppose things like hours for women. They oppose the Equal Rights Amendment that comes up with the passage of suffrage, etc. They are not the supporters of those issues. But these women, and I don't even know why she chose to be, well, she says you learn it from your father, whatever. So apparently her parents were Democrats from Ohio, and so she's a Democrat. And Rankin clearly is a Republican because of her family, and she's a Republican. But obviously they kind of overrode that to some degree, that they had common alliances. Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, I forgot to say, the Equal Rights Amendment is proposed by the Women's Party immediately after the passage of suffrage at the national level. It's the main issue for the League of Women Voters. which we still don't have either. So there's still work to be done. Yeah.
I've been curious about this shift that we see now between the Republicans, where they used to be the progressives, and now they're ultra-conservative, and the Democrats used to be the other way, and now they're the liberals, so to speak. I mean, what caused that to shift like that?
I'm not actually a historian of that. I can't totally tell you. Anybody know?
The New Deal and the Civil Rights.
And the civil rights, the Democrats left the South. They became Republicans. Yeah, particularly the South, that were the Democrats. When Lyndon Johnson proposed he knew that that meant that the party would lose from then on and would lose the South. And it did. And it has never gone back. Yeah. Other questions, comments? What did you learn? What's worthwhile in knowing about all this? I mean, these are not the most flattering pictures in the world either. You'd think they would have come up with something else. What difference does it make? Other than amusement to know these women were out there.
Well, it makes a lot of difference if you just look at where we are now and what we take for granted in terms of just legislation and laws protecting children and everything else that they influence. So the history of our legislation, I think, is the most important reason to remember, and the way we live our lives today.
That there were reasons these government departments got built. Like you were saying, people needed help, and there was this impetus to sort of that this should be, these were public goods that needed to be taken care of publicly, not privately. Better babies. Let's make that a
Tuberculosis
objective to cut down on mortality rates, to not have that be left up to chance or somebody's whim, that this was something that was a public expression that we all needed to get on board with. And that's why you had a government. That's why these departments get created. That's why there's the space for women to get involved to do these things, because the public wanted it. But it wasn't just this inchoate thing, it was a real thing, and it had to be focused by government to do it. And it feels like that is a somewhat distant time now, but there was a reason these things happened. They didn't just happen. People wanted them to happen.
And no one, I think, I never liked the way we teach Rankin. I mean, I really object to it because it makes her this singular, unique person. And she's unique, who isn't? But she did not come out of the head of Zeus, and she did not singularly win suffrage. I mean, it's these tens of thousands of women's groups and all of the male groups that supported them that create change on any issue. I mean, when you think of all this legislation, who are the majority of the voters? 99% they're men in the legislature that have to vote for this. So they are felt needs of a broader community in a way, and we still live with those institutions. But I think, again, at this point in time, we are again questioning what is the role of government itself, what's too much, whatever. And in the West, I think we have a somewhat different view of that than maybe the people on the East have of it. But nonetheless, government is in every aspect of our lives at this point. So what's enough, what's too much? That debate is the most current discussion we probably have, isn't it? I was once talking to Pat Williams about this too, and why do we bother to remember any of this, like particularly Rankin. And he said, sometimes, I'd sit in Congress and be really a tough vote, probably going to vote against my party. He said, I'd close my eyes and I'd think of the courage of Rankin. And I thought about that sometimes in the House. You close your eyes in that body, and all of these people are still there, kind of the ghosts of them. You are not there alone. You are part of this lineage of people who have done this work and will go forward. And that's really gives you support and comfort and reminds you of what it takes. It takes courage, and it takes a hell of a lot of hard work to get anything done. Yeah. But again, they're widows. They don't have children that they're supporting. They have independent means of incomes, and so they can do this work. Yeah. And that's true for pretty much everybody I talked about when you think about it. Yeah. Anybody else, or shall we party on? Thank you. I love this talk. I love being here. It's the best thing in my week. Thank you to the Historical Society. Yay.